today, Living Labs collabs, a DIY plastics compactor, and positivity in global market trends. Hello and welcome to The Bovine. I'm your host, Deborah Murphy. I was listening to a podcast about podcasting recently, and it turns out a host should really introduce themselves with a bit of background. I guess it builds credibility. Since we're at more than 8 shows now, I should probably do that. In addition to having been involved in a farm or ranch of some variety since birth, I've also spent 9 years in agriculture media, writing and reporting on Canadian agriculture. While you'll likely see my face at events or occasionally on social media, it's my preference to either be behind the camera or work in audio. My resume includes experiences like being thrown off a horse, locking myself in a tractor, being chased over a fence by a now cull cow, and once, while walking along a river for B-roll, finding myself up to my armpits in a beaver run. For today's show, we'll hear about making your own ag plastics compactor and share a piece from this summer's Alberta Beef Industry Conference. But first, a name one of my guests hopes every farmer and rancher in Alberta soon knows well, the Living Laboratories Initiative. Well, last month, like many in the agriculture industry, I headed to Calgary, Alberta for some Calgary Stampede related events. And one of those events was actually the announcement of the creation of 9 new living labs in Canada. The programs fall under Agricultural Climate Solutions Living Laboratories Initiative, and that's a $185 million 10-year program that, according to Agriculture and Agri-Food Canada, is, quote, helping to develop and implement farming practices such as nutrient management, shelter belts, and cover crops to sequester carbon and reduce greenhouse gases, end quote. One such Living Labs project is being led by Alberta beef producers with the support of 16 partners. I had the opportunity to chat with Karen Schmid of Alberta Beef Producers and Sherry Stridehorst of Alberta Barley and Alberta Wheat Commission. Here's that interview now. Hello, Karen. Hello, Sherry.
Hi, Deborah.
Hi, Deborah.
So I guess, Karen, can we just start with you? Can you give us some background on what the Living Laboratories Initiative is?
Yeah, so the Living Laboratories Initiative falls under the Agriculture Climate Solutions program, and it's part of the Government of Canada's plan to reduce emissions from the agriculture sector. And as part of this, they've recognized that agricultural producers have some opportunities to both improve carbon sequestration and reduce greenhouse gas emissions. And the whole idea behind the Living Laboratories, which is actually pretty cool, is that it's developed right from the get-go in conjunction with producers. So producers, scientists, other industry stakeholders all sit down together and figure out what best management practices or beneficial management practices might work on their individual operations in their individual situations and help contribute to these environmental goals. Now, at the same time, I think we recognize that, doing some of these environmental things just out of the goodness of our hearts is great. But at the same time, we'd like to focus on really getting those win-wins that help meet those environmental challenges, but also improve producer productivity and profitability.
Is it a step towards finding a value for carbon sequestration?
Yes, I think it is. This project might not put a set value, right? But what it will do is actually provide data measurements that are occurring on farm. And one of the challenges with carbon sequestration is that it's a really slow process, occurs over a long period of time, and is usually pretty incremental. So you don't generally get large jumps in carbon sequestration from a management practice change. But over time and multiplied out over enough acres, that can become significant. And so I think with some of this programming, we'll have some of that data to support what management practice change can and cannot accomplish, and especially in terms of carbon sequestration. as well as where we might need better detection methods, better methodology. Maybe we can't actually measure the changes at the scale they're occurring with the technology we have at the moment. So I think there's a few pieces there, Deborah, that will come into play as some of these policies are moved forward at a federal or even a provincial level.
Sherry, this is probably a new term for a lot of the producers in Alberta, but it's not really new to Canada, is it?
No, I believe there have been living labs in the east, and maybe the closest one to us has been the living lab in Manitoba. And now with this expansion, I think the federal government is really hoping to have this in every province. And it's great that, you know, having the commissions leading this, that we can help shape this so it does benefit producers for our geography.
And how did that all come together? How did the collaboration between different commodity groups come together?
It started with some conversations just between the cropping commissions and our beef and forage groups, just seeing if there were some opportunities where we could work together on something of this scale. And I think those conversations really led to the realization that there are a lot of synergies between the crop sector and the beef and forage sectors, and there's some opportunities there to capitalize on looking at some of those more integrated practices, as well as, you know, thinking about how things that happen in the cropping sector affect the beef and forage sector and vice versa.
Yeah, and maybe if I could just add on to that, you know, I think we were both on the meeting when the program and the concept was introduced, and we saw maybe some similarities in our philosophy of, you know, larger acre commercial farms who are representing large acres, and to really sequester carbon in a meaningful way, it does have to impact large acres. And that's where we saw some synergies. And I think over time, maybe the livestock and the crop sectors have, you know, specialized and gone their different ways. But I think there's some huge wins when we can actually come together and get the benefits from each other's production systems.
What are the next steps for the commodities in developing the living labs in Alberta?
So we do have 6 key areas of focus. They are crop rotations and cropping systems. Those are things like diversifying rotations, looking at fall seeded crops, the use of potentially cover, relay, or intercrops, residue management, those types of things. Land use changes, again, looking at that conversion of marginal land, potentially conservation and restoration of wetlands, looking at forages and vegetative buffer strips, those types of practices. Grazing management, looking at planned livestock grazing on crop or marginal land, looking at different grazing strategies. Then we move into livestock feeding, primarily looking at precision feeding strategies, feed additives, diet formulation strategies. And then there's nutrient management, which really encompasses things like the 4 R's of nutrient stewardship, right place, right rate, right source, and right time. Variable rate fertilizer application, nitrification inhibitors, manure application, looking at composting, potentially arrangements between crop and livestock producers for manure use. And then finally, our last area of focus is increasing carbon on the whole farm. And this basically recognizes that any land base is not going to store carbon the same in every location. And so how can you maximize or optimize where that sequestration of carbon occurs on a farm system level? And so those are our key areas of focus that we'll be looking to engage with producers on, and those beneficial management practices will be fine-tuned and optimized to fit individual producer situations. And so really our next steps, we have a lot of logistics to work out in the background. And once we have those worked out, we'll be looking to host some information sessions in 3 key regions. The Peace, kind of west central Alberta, and then down in the south around the Lethbridge area. So we'll host some key information sessions for interested producers where they can learn more information. and hopefully indicate whether or not they'd be interested in participating. After that, we would be sitting down, figuring out what data we need to collect from producers in terms of supporting the socioeconomic analysis, which is really about looking at the barriers and incentives to adoption and how we can spread adoption out beyond just the participants in the Living Lab.
We typically think of these kind of things as research, but really it's extension. It's taking and putting these practices on the landscape and making them work in reality. And that whole co-development piece is such a, I think, a beautiful part of the extension with this and collecting real life data, farm scale data. So I think it's really just taking all those high core level things that Karen talked about, those 6 areas, and tweaking them for on-farm and real life use. And that's where I think there's just such applicability out of this program.
So, if I'm a farmer or rancher listening to this podcast, hopefully there's a plethora right now. And one of those things interested me, one of those topics interested me. What would it look like for a farmer or rancher who did get involved? What would what am I doing? Does it have to be a new practice? And how do I collaborate with this group?
So it has to be a new practice to some extent. So if, for example, I'll use a rotational grazing example. So say I'm rotationally grazing on one quarter, but not on another. I could expand that practice onto another quarter, and that would be applicable. Or maybe I'm tweaking it, and maybe I want to move to an even a more intensive mob grazing type of rotation instead of just the rotation I'm using. So we can tweak existing practices, but it can't just be business as usual for participation. And I would say there's lots of opportunity for producers if they've been thinking about trying something but are not sure where to start. That's where our researchers and their expertise can really help try to fine tune that and set them up for success right out of the gate.
Because you'll kind of have some mentors in that respect.
I think so. And really, as the program moves along, those participants in the program will become mentors as well, right? They will know what worked and what didn't and what needs tweaking for the next time. And they're going to be an invaluable resource moving forward for other producers potentially interested in some similar types of ideas.
Is there space for group involvement? So for example, if my neighbor is a farmer and I'm a rancher and we've always wondered about ways that we can work together, could we collaborate in this respect under Living Labs?
So, I think maybe I'll break down the numbers a little bit. We're kind of looking to target 15 farms in the Peace, 15 farms around that Edmonton area and 15 farms around the south, and get those get those projects in place, but then the next year grow them. And I think it's exactly where me and my neighbor, if I think of my neighbor is a cattle guy and I'm a crop guy, and we want to change that business as usual and look at where we can do manure sharing, straw trading, things like that, and keeping the weed seeds manageable and within that system and contained. And I think that's where there are these really exciting partnerships between neighbors. And then hopefully as we work through the 5 years, each year, we get more and more neighbors interested and participating in the program.
And I think too, there's a real opportunity in each region for producers that are interested in similar activities to really brainstorm those together. So if it was Deborah, if it was you and your neighbor that came to a co-development session and you're like, we'd really like to see how this would work between the two of us and how we could figure this out, there's be some resources there available to help you work through that process.
What does success look like to you both in terms of 5 years goes by and, we're looking back fondly on all these collaborations and networking events and also the initiative itself? What is success?
Maybe I'll take a first stab at it and then Karen can weigh in. And, I think we have a lot of policies coming down on agriculture, and it's the chance to work through this system and figure out what is really practical on farm. So if, we figure out that, by increasing the amount of fall seeded crops or winter seeded crops in the cropping system, and if we can grow that from where it is today by 10, 20% and get more acres into that and show the value in terms of carbon sequestration and reduce greenhouse gas emissions in that, and have data that can support these practices that work logistically really well on farm, are economically sound on farm. And I think Karen in the beginning mentioned those win-wins, and it's really targeting in on those win-wins because we have this research at, the level of the researcher, but it's really blowing it up and making it practical on large acres so we can make input or progress, I should say, on reducing greenhouse gas emissions and sequestering more carbon with these practices that are maybe proven high in the pie in the sky, but putting them on the landscape and really getting practice change. And it's not easy, but I do think this program has some tremendous tools to lead us down that path.
I think for me, success really looks like a few different things. One, we have a really important opportunity here to be able to demonstrate to the federal government what is feasible and what is not feasible, and where extra incentives are needed if they really want to push this climate agenda. How can we make it work, and what incentives are necessary for it to work for producers? The second thing I see is really that integration of the on-farm practical experience of producers themselves merging with that research expertise. And how can we adapt some of those research concepts that sound really good in theory, but how can we adapt them in practice, and how do they work, like Sherry said, logistically? On a very small level, I think success looks like having a core group of producers stay in the program for the entire 5 years and see value in that. On a larger scale, ideally, we'd like to see the adoption of some of these practices spread beyond our core participants and out into the wider community across agricultural producers in Alberta. And so part of the socioeconomic analysis is looking at those adoption levels and how they changed and may be impacted by the Living Labs programming. And if we see some uptake outside of our participants and see that peer-to-peer networking and learning experiences having an impact, I think it might even revolutionize some of the models and some of the ways we think about doing extension and adoption work within agriculture. So that's what I'd like to see ideally.
That was Karen Schmid, Beef Production and Extension Lead with Alberta Beef Producers, and Sherry Stridehorst, Agronomy Research Specialist with Alberta Barley and Alberta Wheat Commission. We'll keep you updated on the work of Living Labs on ABP Daily and our social channels. But if you have specific questions or you want to get involved, you can email Karen. Her email address is karens@albertabeef.org. You can also sign up to receive ABP's newsletter, The Monthly Minute. You'll get it straight to your email inbox. It includes a recap of the biggest stories from our site, upcoming events, and updates from ABP staff. Look for that link in the show notes. Up next, new delegate Colin Rice takes the host chair to find out more about building his own plastics compactor.
Some people cut their burger in half.
Huh?
Yeah, I'm more of an eat-it-whole kind of person. That's how I burger. How do you burger?
I'm a squisher.
I'm a picker.
I'm a clean freak.
I'm a dripper.
Eat one half and save the rest?
Eat the whole thing, it's the best. Flip it, tip it, tear it, dip it. Don't want carbs, no bun, just skip it. How you burger's up to you.
Just make sure that patty's good. Alberta beef is how I burger. Fresh and local, ask your server.
There's no other, can't you see?
Man, we love Alberta beef.
How do you burger?
Tell us at howdoyouburger.ca for a chance to win the ultimate barbecue prize pack from Alberta Beef.
I'm Colin Rice. I'm a new delegate for the Alberta Beef Producers, and I've been talking with Deborah about this plastic because I'd seen this on her podcast episode earlier. So it was interesting to me, and then she thought that we should do this guest host sort of thing and maybe ask some more questions from an actual producer. So I farm near Lacombe, with my cousin, my dad, and my uncle. We've got a bit of a unique setup with that sort of thing. We have a mixed operation, and there's 1,500 acres of grain and 200 cow-calf pairs, and then we have a small feedlot of 1,500 head. So with that and the silage and everything that we have, we end up with lots of plastic. So I heard on episode 3 of the Bovine, and I wanted to learn more about the full circle plastics. So I learned that you guys developed this compactor right here in the province. And I guess I should introduce you for this podcast. This is Jonathan Beekman, the owner and developer of Full Circle Plastics. Can you tell us a little bit about that, Jonathan?
Sure. So Full Circle Plastics, we started in 2016, and we had a bit of a market for a few products, and we actually took over existing recycled plastic manufacturing plant, but Full Circle Plastics started in 2016. Now, basically, I buy granulated plastics from multiple suppliers, and we process that into end use products. Initially, we started off doing all our granulating ourselves, but we wanted to focus on manufacturing, which took us out of the granulating processing game. And right now we focus 100% on sourcing recycled plastics and manufacturing plastic lumber out of it. Now, Clean Farms, they have a large source of plastic with the chemical jugs, which we incorporate in some of our products. And we got to know Clean Farms a little bit. And I'd approached them at one point about the possibility of working with ag plastic, the grain bags. But that didn't go anywhere. I wasn't set up to process them, and I wasn't willing to make the investment into that. In the meantime, we have a local Alberta company, Polyag Recycling. They currently are set up to process. Now, we've used some of their product. We've used some grain bags in our product, not pelletized, and we've used a little bit of Polyag's pelletized ag plastics in our process, but we don't currently use a lot of the film plastic, the grain bag, the bale wrap, the silage plastic in our process. Now, a couple of years ago, I was at a conference and I ran into someone from Clean Farms, and in conversation, he said, in Quebec, there's some guys building a square box and taking a concrete Lego block, basically, a 2.5 by 2.5 foot block, and fill this square box up with plastic, set the Lego block on top, and they're able to compact this plastic quite well, and they're able to get enough weight so we can actually ship this product. Okay. Now, grain bags, the way they're rolled up, you can always weight out a truck. I should rephrase that. If a grain bag is rolled up properly, you can weight out a truck and it can make it to market, and the market will actually pay for the freight to get it there. So It ends up being able to be recycled. Bale wrap, silage plastic, on the other hand, because they're not consistent size, because they're not, every farmer has a different way of dealing with it. Recyclers have kind of shied away from it because you can get maybe 10,000 kg of plastic in a load that should have 17 to 20,000 kg on it. And so it doesn't even pay for the freight necessarily to get it to market. Now, market rates vary, but for something to be economical, it has to be consistently at some point.
So that's when you decided to come up with a compactor sort of thing. Did you develop that yourself, or how did that come about?
So basically, I make plastic lumber, and the Clean Farms representative, he's like, are you able to build this box out of your lumber? And would it do the same thing? because at the time I was using Clean Farms, some of their plastics, and he figured, hey, this would be a good story. And I said, yeah, definitely, I can do that. He said, well, would you be under, and he had a very low budget. I said, yes, I could be. Then Clean Farms said, you know what, we'd like you to build us a prototype and come up with some ideas. So first of all, a couple of things we wanted to do was build it out of something that was easily accessible to anyone. And also we wanted to, you know what, keep the budget in consideration. So the first one I built was, the majority of it was drill stem pipe. And still to this day, the majority of it is drill stem pipe. Now, drill stem has, although it is still accessible, it's becoming less accessible this last 2 years. And so we built out drill stem pipe and plastic lumber that I usually have in stock. I have 2x3, 1x4, and 2 pieces of 4x4, 3.5 by 3.5. And so we designed this thing, and as we worked through different design elements, we ended up using a chain hoist to compact it down. Most farmers have a chain hoist laying in their shop, and we used a cable winch to pull it up. And so we were able to get almost, I think our initial testing was 550 pounds in a 42-inch by 42-inch by 24-inch bale. Now that bale rose up to about 30 inches over the next 2 weeks as it expanded a little bit. It was tied off with baler twine. Now the beautiful thing about stacking it, that 550-pound weight, you can get 3 of those bales stacked on top of each other in a trailer, in a van body, or a container, which is what most companies use to ship that product to market. Basically, we were able to, with that silage plastic, get a full weight out a trailer to get it to market.
That's awesome progress. So where are you located? Like, is this a market that's available for all of Alberta or just down south? I think that's where I saw that you guys were located. So like, is it possible that this is something that can be accessible to farmers across the province?
So the initial market for the silage plastic was in Arkansas, a firm called Revolution Plastics. And basically it's because if you have unlimited grain bags to work with, and the grain bags are always cleaner, why are you going after these other lower quality products? The farmer, on average, dealing with silage plastics, looks at it and saying, if no one accepts this, why are we going to waste our time keeping it clean? And so the goal in this is, number one, if you can get a market to actually accept it. So Revolution Plastics was the first market that said they'd accept it, and their terms were, you got to wait out a trailer, or we're going to send you a bill. Great, we'll figure out how to wait out a trailer. The next step is, if a farmer, and I'm going to say if anyone, finds out there's a good market for their waste, other than landfill, incineration, whatever was previously done for it, they will actually put effort into making sure that it's clean enough to get accepted by that market. And so that's the next step. If there's a consistent bale that can be picked up, or that can be accepted, let's say at your local transfer stations or that type of thing, if there's consistency, then you can create transportation, then markets will accept it.
It's great, like a chicken and egg sort of thing. That is good to know. So in an earlier episode of the podcast, it was mentioned that you guys might be making the instructions for this compactor open access so they can build their own. Can anybody build this thing? Or is there a certain sort of set of skills that you should require if you're going to try and put one of these things together?
The ag plastic baler takes a little bit of welding skills, which most farmer I think, is born with those, or very soon after they get them. And a bit of carpentry skills. All our plastic is screwed together with, we use a GRK framing screw, so it's a little stronger screw than your standard decking screw. Okay. And yeah, it's fairly basic.
So people that don't have the welding skills can they order it straight from you? And do you have pricing details on how they might be able to order that?
So in our initial pricing, we had a goal of under $2,000. The last 2 years, our products, as well as the steel we use, has more than doubled in price. And due to just supply chain challenges, as well as, everything's gone up. The last one we sold was just over $4,000. And basically, that includes the winch, that includes it's a fully working model. Our hydraulic option will be very similar in price. So I think, $4,006 was the last order that came in, and was where our pricing was at.
All right. This is all great to hear. I think we've probably gone through as many questions as I could come up with for the podcast. Is there kind of anything else you felt like you should touch on a little bit, or maybe give your website and people can go have a look at it?
So our website is www.fullcircleplastics.com. Right. And I think we've got links to Facebook and Instagram if you're looking for ideas or pictures. So we build a multitude of products. We everything from garden, and then we also manufacture some products out of our plastic, including the ag plastics baler, park benches, picnic tables that get sold into municipalities, as well as private customers, as well as garden boxes. So there's a bunch of ideas on our website, and take a look.
Awesome. Well, I think that's about it for us here on this podcast. Thanks for joining us, Jonathan. That was great, and we'll send people your way if they have more questions.
Thank you.
That was Jonathan Beekman, owner of Full Circle Plastics, and guest host Colin Rice. You can learn more about Full Circle Plastics by heading to their website, fullcircleplastics.com. There you'll find some of the products Jonathan mentioned, including garden boxes, plastic lumber, and tons of project ideas. If you're interested in building your own plastics compactor, check out the show notes for Full Circle Plastics PDF instructions. And if DIY is just not your thing, you can get in touch with Full Circle Plastics to find out more about ordering the end result. And they actually now have a new hydraulic option as well. Thanks to Colin Rice for agreeing to bring his questions to the show, and to everyone else who reached out to learn more about the compactor. Up next, could there be some positivity in the cattle market? An interview from Alberta Beef Industry Conference.
Hello, I'm Johanna Murray, Extension Coordinator and host of PCBFA's Coffee, Cows and Crops, and you're listening to The Bovine.
It has been incredibly hard to plan any sort of event in the past couple of years, so here is a shout out to the organizers of Alberta Beef Industry Conference, who went with the flow and ultimately sold out their June conference. And it turns out the timing couldn't have been better, with rain not only lifting spirits, but also allowing attendees a chance to put their farm lists on hold and head out for some networking.
Alberta Beef Industry Conference was started 20 years ago. Next year's our 20th anniversary. We're going to do it in Banff to kick it off. And so it's a collaboration between us, Alberta Cattle Feeders, Alberta Beef Producers, Western Stock Growers, Alberta Auction Market Associations, and Alberta Livestock Dealer and Order Buyer Association. And at the end of the day, it's great to have the whole chain here from the time you grow the calf to by the time it gets into our yard. So all participating together and coming alongside each other to put on this event.
That's the voice of Jacob Buchert, chair of Alberta Cattle Feeders Association. And while it has been a couple of months since the conference, I do want to share with you a conversation I had with one of the presenters following the event. Deborah Murphy here. We're at Alberta Beef Industry Conference, and I'm joined by Brett Stewart, who's the founding partner of Global Agri Trends. Hello, Brett.
Hello, Deborah.
So you talked today about tailwinds blowing for global beef markets. That was the title of your presentation. It sounds pretty positive. Is it positive?
I think so. I think it's a positive message. There are a lot of big moving parts in the macro markets, in the global beef markets. But I feel like we're setting up for some very good years in the beef industry.
So what's making you say that?
Well, a couple things. One is just fundamental supply. We know the U.S. herd is in decline. We know the Canadian herd is in decline. Declining herds mean higher prices. And it's unfortunate when you see a drought and when people have to sell their cattle early due to drought. But that lends to higher prices. And so fundamentally, we're moving into a time of tighter supplies. One of the things that does is it helps shift leverage between the packer and the cattle feeder and the cow-calf producer. And so the guy with the cattle producing the cattle has kind of gotten the short end of the stick through all the COVID demand. And we've seen packer margins just go astronomical. And so as we shrink this herd and get down to the point where we potentially have fewer cattle than packing shackles, that shifts the leverage back and pulls more money onto the ranch and into the feedlot. And I think we're heading that direction. So from a fundamental supply standpoint, I think we are looking towards higher prices.
You also talked about globally that, you said that our herds are going down, and in other areas people are trying to build up their herds, and that's working in our favor as well?
Yeah, it's kind of interesting, Deborah, because in Australia, so they went through years of drought, like 7-8 years of drought. 2 years ago, when it got dry here, it got wet there. And that's what La Nina does. La Nina makes it dry here, wet in Australia. So as they finally got rain, they had destocked 20% of their cow herd. So they instantly try to restock everything, pull every available heifer to breed, and all of a sudden their production dropped 15% last year. Exports out of Australia down 15% last year. So in Japan and Korea, our key markets, we had a lot more opportunity to sell last year because of those tight supplies. And so Australia's had a declining production. They're the only country out there that's really starting to rebuild. South America, you can look at Brazil, Uruguay, those herds have been in decline as well. They have been killing very aggressively for China. And so, in my opinion, I think they've overkilled their heifers. And so I think they've reduced their ability to expand and have a smaller herd. So globally, bottom line is, there are fewer beef cows on earth than there were a year ago. And I think that's going to continue into next year as well.
And consumers are still demanding the same amount of beef?
And consumers are still loving beef. It's incredible to me. I look and we see gas prices go up. We see the heavy inflation, housing costs, and retail beef prices are above $7.30 a pound. It's just incredible to me how much consumers love beef. And I think that's fantastic news for the industry. Also, high chicken prices. Chicken breast prices are up over $3.40 a pound. That's very supportive to our grinding beef prices. And so I think across the spectrum, things are really good right now. As we see the interest rates hike, as we see some of this action, the fear turns to recession. And I think sometimes we look out and feel like we're just ready to go off a cliff here soon. But typically, a recession doesn't really clobber the beef industry. We can go look back at history and see that. And so, yeah, consumers will be doing some belt tightening over the next year. There's no doubt about it. But I don't think that is going to clobber our beef prices. Again, our supplies are tight, demand is good. Both of those things are positive for beef prices, especially for cattle prices going forward.
What about the beyond idea? There's, we see in the news a lot talking about alternative proteins, and you mentioned it in your talk today. Is that a big competitor coming into the next few years, or is that a fad that has died?
No, yeah, that's a good question. I get that question a lot, the alt meat question. And I've been such a naysayer, and I don't know. Probably because I'm a cattle guy, right? What cattle guy can agree with that? When they started out, when Beyond Meat started out and raised hundreds of millions of dollars of investor money, it was just huge buzz, and it was all over the news, and we've solved every problem there is with livestock. And I have not bought it. I just don't think that's a viable business. And my advice was, don't confuse investor appetite with consumer appetite to buy their product. The investors loved anything new, anything techy, anything you could IPO anything and raise hundreds of millions of dollars. And that's what they did. But the reality is, Beyond Meat, if you go back and look at their earnings, and you have to dig really hard to find out their earnings and losses. They don't report that. They report revenue. But my last number, I don't think I had last quarter in, they had lost about $165 million since they've been in business. Their stock price went from up above $240 a share. They're at like $24 a share. They've lost 90% of their stock value. And I just think that really confirms what I think most of us in the beef industry have believed for and hoped for, is that Americans just aren't really ready. I don't think they made a good selling point of being healthier or cheaper or better. And if you can't do one of those three, I just don't think you have that good of a product. And so I think they'll be out there. I think the alt proteins will always be out there. But I think they're going to be kept in that tiny little niche box that they're in today.
Can we move back to trade for a second? Because you did talk about Indonesia. Indonesia's had a few key findings in their beef industry. Can you tell us about the disease outbreaks there?
Yeah, right. So a few months ago, they discovered foot and mouth disease in Indonesia, and they identified it as coming from India. Now, Indonesia isn't a big player in the beef markets. We don't hear a lot about Indonesia. I think they're the 5th largest population on Earth. It's a massive country. Over 10,000 islands. It's just the island chain in Southeast Asia. The risk is foot and mouth disease is an export killer. If you find a case of foot and mouth disease, your exports are done. They're not over. They're over to the US, Japan, Korea. You're relegated to exporting to places that India exports beef at very cheap prices. And so the risk for Australia, when they see a disease outbreak like that, it's just in one end of Indonesia. But it is very close in proximity to Australia, and there are about 1.5 million Australians vacation in Bali every year. And so the risk is that that virus is going to spread through Indonesia, potentially creating a highway through Australian airports where the virus could eventually get into Australia, which would lead to widespread export bans. And so they're very concerned about it. And so, yeah, we've done a lot of work trying to get a feel for what Indonesia is going to do about it. And the word is, one, they're very short on vaccine. Vaccine's not really an option for Indonesia. Two, their industry is very unstructured. It's a lot of backyard cattle, impossible to regulate movements. And three, the best way to stop FMD is to kill, burn, and bury carcasses. It's highly contagious. And the Indonesian government is very concerned about food security. So the odds of that are very low. And so I think what we're going to see, FMD just end up covering the entire country of Indonesia and raising the risk that potentially could get into the Australian beef sector.
Does it mean anything for North America at this point?
Well, Australia is one of the biggest beef suppliers into North America, and they're our biggest beef competitor in Japan and Korea, and they compete with us in China. And so if something were to happen to Australian beef exports, that would severely limit their beef coming to us and their beef going into North Asia. So yeah, it's something, it would have a major impact on our markets were that to happen. And yeah, it would be to our benefit, but I don't think any producer in North America wants that to happen. The spread of these kind of animal diseases is not good for anyone. And so hopefully they'll be able to manage and put some firewalls in place and prevent that from happening. But it is a big wild card out on the markets.
I think I could probably talk to you all day, but for people who haven't been here, and just to kind of wrap up, what are some key takeaways that you think beef producers in Alberta should consider from your talk today and from your knowledge?
Well, I think things are good here for Alberta. I've been seeing all the rain, and a lot of the U.S. is in drought. Rain is a fantastic thing in the cattle world. I think we are set up for some very good years of cattle prices. I think the declining U.S. herd is very positive just from an overall supply standpoint, as well as the shift of leverage through the packer to be able to get more of that consumer dollar through the packer. And so I think we've got some very positive things to look forward to the next 2 to 3 years in the cattle markets in Alberta. Demand-wise, things are good. We may go through some recession. There may be some bumps and lumps, but I don't think that's a reason to change your strategic plans with ranching. I think worldwide, I think we're going to be tight on beef for the next 10 years. I think there's going to be opportunities. We're adding 73 million people a year to the planet, and I think anyone in the business of producing food, especially a product like beef that is so beloved by consumers in Canada and the US, I think the future is very good.
Brett Stewart, thank you so much for your time today.
Thank you, Deborah.
That was Brett Stewart, founding partner at Global Agri-Trends. In case you need to book some time off or call dibs on going to the 2023 Alberta Beef Industry Conference, will be hosted at the Fairmont Banff Springs Hotel, February 22nd to 24th. That's all for this episode of The Bovine. I could tell you to rate the show and share it with a friend and all that jazz, but instead, go to howdoyouburger.ca, enter, and you will be in the draw to win an Ultimate Summer prize package. I believe it's $1,000 value. A barbecue, maybe some beef, get some friends over. Have a great August, stay safe, and I'll talk to you in September.